Okay, this is The Other Founding Fathers by Rick Helly. This just recently was published through Game Crafters. I don't know if it says it anywhere on here. Which is apparently a means of sort of self-publishing games. Surprisingly good quality in terms of the components. This is something I wanted. I looked at it and saw it was a print and play game that's available, and it is still available. Based on some of the ideas behind Republic of Rome, but set in, and modified to suit this, set in early United States. Post-constitutional, Washington's president, etc. And let's see, I was fairly excited about the idea, but I am so bad about print and play. There's another one on Imperial Rome, also based on Republic of Rome, that I have the files for somewhere I haven't put together. And then, I have a couple of them kicking around down here that I just haven't put together. I just don't have the effort to do that. So when this came out, Rick, I guess, contacted everyone, the designer contacted everyone who was, had marked a want to have type thing on it over on Board Game Geek with an email and just said, hey, I published it. And, anyway, I ended up picking it up after ascertaining that no, this wasn't an offer for a free review copy. Did a little bit of thinking about it because, it's tough for me to trust buying a new game. I have to buy all my games and just about, and it's tough for me to come to the decision of, I'm going to take a risk on this new company. But I had seen some of his work on some other games. He had done some Q&A type stuff on some of the Phil Eklund games, and I decided I'll take a chance on somebody because he seemed to have the kind of mind that would work well in terms of designing and developing a game. So I wanted to take a look at this, and I knew I would never print it out. So let's take a look at what we got here. I've already set it up. I've set up the 6-player game. There's a number of different variants. I think it holds as little as 3. There's no 2-player variant in here, but there probably is somewhere. It probably is kind of iffy, but it probably would have added a lot of pages, just like Republic of Rome's 2-player and solitaire games. What you've got in this, as far as I can understand, is a game where the goal is for your coalition to kind of gather up the most popularity for the things they do. It's not really like the Republic of Rome cutthroat situation. I also suspect, although I don't know, this is the first playing coming ahead, that the game's not going to be as harsh and dangerous as ROR is. It's going to present you... There are some risks, but there doesn't seem to be an everybody loses situation. It's not a semi-co-op like Republic of Rome. Which I find kind of a shame, but because there is I may be mistaken, there is a really bad situation, which is the government collapses due to financial debt. But I think you still determine a winner at that point. And there's also the tension chart, which can lead to the Civil War. Now, obviously, if the historical situation is all the Americans lost because there was a Civil War, that would be a little funny feeling, perhaps. Although it is such a terrible event that maybe it would make sense. You've got a board which serves mainly as a track, like in Republic of Rome here. You have your victory point track that you're going to collect those on, and you have additional discs in case victory points go too high. You have a source of revenue and cash on hand. And you can see the revenue here actually starts out negative. This is where to track the different factions, number of votes in Congress. Now, a player is a faction. But what those factions are is kind of tough to comprehend. They're just a collection of people. Now, the people are represented as, your statesmen or whatever, with two different colored cards. And one side is conservative, the kind of orangish side, more the Federalists, and one side is more liberal, the Jeffersonian Democrats, and Jacksonian Democrats to boot. But as you can see, we have a mixture here. And in fact, the game's expecting that. And as we go through the rules, you'll see there doesn't seem to be a distinguishment. What a player actually is just a collection of these people. It's not like it's a political current or a group of nepotists or anything like that. And that immediately brings kind of a very worried flavor to my mouth. I was kind of hoping maybe for something more. Well, the Republic of Rome, for example, handles that by excluding certain people from being with each other, and then it doesn't really state their philosophy. These cards state the philosophy of the different people, which is a nice factor, but I don't feel like it works terribly well in terms of trying to figure out who the hell a player actually is. And you'll see more of that later. I guess I was hoping for something more like La Révolution Française, which has real currents in it. And not in terms of the board and everything, but in terms of the alignments that, anyway. So then you have these different player cards, and I'll go over what's on each thing. You have these are taxes. These are going to be your issues, which are kind of randomized. They're sort of your crises type things, but my figuring, without looking through them carefully because I want to be kind of surprised, is that these are not going to be as earth-shattering and world-threatening as the first deck of Republic of Rome is. Maybe there might be enough risk to be the equivalent of the later decks. But there is no mechanism for that I can see for the country being destroyed. Maybe there's a card that just does that, like the War of 1812 or something. You also have these action cards, and I can show you a couple of these because everybody starts out with a couple. And they comprise some of the statesmen, the ones that are left, and then these things that will, I believe, be reshuffled into the deck as different eras go. Like Republic of Rome, it's a 3-era game. We've got different eras of issues. Different eras of actions. There's actually different eras of issues as well, set aside here. And these should, I wonder if oh, this is era 2. Okay. And the issues have new political people. You also see here we have a representation of a map of the colonies at this point, well, of the United States at this point. Not every state has its own card, but each card is going to be its own. This is primarily used for elections. Each card is going to be its own little electoral prize that you can get. And then a bunch of cubes that are used. These guys are going to be used for elections. These are limitations so that the president doesn't get elected more than twice. There's a presumption that Washington will be Washington and that everyone else will follow his example. Until FDR, who isn't in the game yet. Maybe someday it'll extend that far. These are little popularity counters, and then these are bigger valued counters. These are influence markers, which are going to be used, expended for political capital. A couple other little pieces you have here. Oh, here's where the action deck goes. It said near the board, but there's apparently a slot for it. This is the newspapers, which you're able to use to gain yourself public support, essentially, by using these. And you essentially get it by pumping your way up into these locations. And the further along you get it, the longer your newspaper lasts and the more points of public support you get. That public support is going to be represented by the dichotomy between liberals and conservatives, which is sort of the backdrop of the game, but not really anyone's goal. You also have some player aid cards, 3 copies of these, enough to put between all the players, and they'll give some information that's necessary to help you play the game more quickly and effectively. And we got offices. Some of them have been assigned already to their historical people. Others are available for the president to assign. And we'll see how some of these mechanisms work as I go through the rules. And there's a die, which I will probably replace because, I don't know, there's nothing wrong with it, but I like different dice for whatever reason. Okay. Let us take a look at this rather rich rule book in terms of size. Much easier to read, and it's a simpler game than Republic of Rome. Let's go over what some of the stuff is. So on these cards we have a bunch of information: the era the person's from, their home state, which the initial setup of cards, so Tennessee's not actually in the game initially. Those guys can exist because they were kind of randomly drawn. So at the beginning of the game, you end up drawing a bunch of leaders. There's a bunch that are sort of preset for each number of players. And there are scenarios for other periods. I'm playing the full campaign, 3 deck, whatever, but there are later starts and such not. But you also get some randoms, and both DeWitt Clinton and Andy Jackson are random characters who came out here. But it's okay that Jackson's from Tennessee. Later, if you're playing someone like the dude we already turned over, William Henry Harrison, Ohio has to be a state for him to come into play. So there's an incentive for Washington to include Ohio over in the states. All right, what else we have? We have the name, we have some historical information here. Over here we have their ability, and whether or not that ability is military as well as political. And then they have a popularity rating. And that's their base popularity. They have an alignment, liberal or conservative, which matches the colors. A number of votes in Congress. The votes that I have up there are simply the sum. So here it's 9, 11, running through these guys. That's the green player, so he's on 11. And then this number down here, which is the age number. Unlike Republic of Rome, we're going to track people's age. Basically, there's going to be random deaths that come out on some of the issue cards. There'll be a skull on them. And that means someone dies. Who? Well, it's most likely to be the oldest person on the board. And at this point, the oldest person is character number 1, Ben Franklin. The second oldest is George Washington. And then the third oldest should be John Adams, yeah. Those are only the oldest 3 that are available on the turned face up are available to be killed by this. You're not going to have random deaths like that, although maybe there are cards in here to cause, the duel between Burr and Hamilton or something like that, which would be kind of cool. And I'm sure there's something like that in here. Okay. I guess that's all we have here. These are kind of like issue cards. They're going to have a difficulty to enact and an amount of popularity if you pass or fail it, and effects that come from it. Now these are all taxes, which are always available for the president to try to propose, and that's kind of important because you start with a revenue of -30. All right. I think this may be the victory points here. That's what it looks like. For each popularity cube that you get, you're going to get a victory point when that person dies or at the end of the game. For each black cube, which are negative popularity, we didn't see them because they're kind of hard to see, but they're in here too. For each negative popularity, you lose a point. And then for each big white cube, those are just 5 pointers. If the Civil War happens, you're going to lose points for your congressional votes plus your influence. So if you're a powerful faction and the Civil War happens on your watch, that's bad for you. It may actually be everybody loses if the government collapses due to a revenue issue. Let us see. All right. Which at least gives you some pressure. So we've done the setup, which in general was handing out so that each player has 3 of these cards and then 2 of these action cards from the remainder. So you have a fixed set of certain statesmen and then some random ones perhaps, well, almost certainly, to fill you out the 3 cards, and then 2 more of these cards. If you remember my Republic of Rome coverage, there's a problem with playing that game in 6 players because you're pulling 3 politicians out of the deck for each player and 3 red cards from the deck for each player. So the initial deck starts out as just all bad stuff, or much more than if you're playing in 3 players. So you get a very different experience depending on the number of players. So you have to modify, in my opinion, the number of cards that you hand out, and the game's hard enough, even in 3, that I've gone towards the lower end on those cards to hand out less cards when you're playing in 6. You don't have to worry about that here because the action cards are not filled with bad stuff. These are where the politicians in these cards are drawn from. It's the issues that are the bad stuff, and you have a fixed number of those each turn. They may also include some good stuff. Damned if I know, right? Okay. What else did we have here? We assigned the offices as per starting setup. Everybody got a pile of influence markers and this, that, and the other. And basically everything's set up as I kind of explained. Now, the play of a turn. The play of a turn is going to have 4 stages to it. First, we're going to deal with the issues. That's really the president's job, and then he assigns that to different politicians, well, different office holders to handle in perhaps. We'll see how that works. Then we deal with the Treasury, how much money, the revenues that's brought in, lost, whatever, and that can cause some problems. Then we have the election, which is going to be handled over on these cards, and it's its own little, complex little sub-game that's handled kind of like the military game over in Republic of Rome is a separate sort of system. Well, this is a completely separate system. And then we go to the people, which is really kind of the player turns that are built in. Slightly different type of order of play, but we'll see. Okay. So, during the issues stage, the president has the following things he can do. He has to draw 4 issue cards in the course of his turn, 1 per year. But he can do these other things interleaved with his issue cards. He has to resolve an issue, though, before he goes to the next one, in one way or another. So he can pass or repeal taxes. At the beginning, you start with none, but that probably has to be fixed, so the government has to start setting up a source of revenue. He can pass or repeal at most 1 tariff. Now, tariffs I don't believe are in here. I think they're... Oh, no, they are. Here they are. They have different... they're taxes, but taxes that are somewhat more palatable on the public. We'll see why. Then he can appoint offices. If he has any vacant offices, and there are some sitting over here, he can appoint those as needed. He has to appoint them by the end of the round, and he has to appoint them if there's an issue that requires that office to take care of the issue. He can delegate power to the vice president. Once during his 4-year term, he can take one of the issues and say, this is your football, dude. Handle it. Okay. When the issue deck is... when it runs out, well, certain unresolved issues and maybe certain resolved issues get shuffled into the next deck. So you can put things on the back burner. Like, I think slavery is one of these issues. States, if you don't get a state that enters into the game, it'll come up as an issue again in a later deck. Anyway, when you come to the 3rd deck, when you run out of that, then you just reshuffle the last few issues and handle them, and I think the game automatically ends at the end of after the next election on that. Okay, as I said, the Hand of Time causes deaths when that's drawn. Okay, in order to do an issue, let's take a look at one of these. So, an issue, I'm trying to see if I have a good example of one. Okay. Issues may have certain requirements before you can use them. So here it says requirement, end of slavery, not resolved. Yeah. You have people who are involved in it. Like this would be the Secretary of the Treasury and the Congress. The plus Congress means Congress has to succeed in passing the suggestion. So it's not enough to just have someone in your administration handle it. You do actually have to get it passed through Congress. Some cases, it could just be an act of one of the office holders. So the president's first decision is whether the issue is going to be addressed at all. If he chooses to ignore it, there is a value up here. Now, this is the pass, fail, and then there's an ignore option beyond that on the non-tax issues. The ignore option will take effect if the president just decides to ditch it. I believe that's the breakdown. Let me see. Okay. Popularity gain loss. No value for failed or ignored means gain loss is 0. Okay. So yeah, I believe it goes succeed. Yeah, it's not really listed there. And it's not really listed on here either. I think it's success, failure, and then ignored. Those are the three options. Okay. So if the president decides not to ignore the issue, if he decides to ignore it, the popularity losses are applied only to the president at that point. If he decides not to ignore it, the rest, then he hands the card to the office holder. So in this case, it would go to the Treasury. It could just go to the president himself in some cases. And the president can suggest, sometimes there's sometimes there's issues that have multiple different resolutions possible. He can suggest which one he wants the office holder to handle. Now, the office holder doesn't have to follow him. That can be dangerous, huh? It's also possible that some things will be split where one office holder can do it or another one, and you have a choice between different ones. And the president gets to choose who to punt it to in that case. When you resolve an issue, the office holder has to have enough ability, so he's got 3 ability here, to pass it. That has to be enough to match the difficulty of the issue. If he doesn't have enough, he can throw influence points in. And those can either be, I believe, on his own card. I believe leaders can have their own influence. Or just part of his faction influence, which is, of course, more valuable because it's more flexible. If he can't match that or chooses not to, the issue fails and the failure results take place. If he succeeds, well, if it has a congressional vote, then the players have to vote it in Congress. And starting from the left, and I go counterclockwise instead of clockwise, so it'll be to the right, of the president, each player in turn has to vote. Unlike Republic of Rome, you can't choose who's going to make, who has to vote first. I kind of like that parliamentary power in Republic of Rome, but it probably slows the game down a little bit and doesn't really add that much to things in a game like this, where you either want something or you don't. There's no real room for debate in here, but I would assume that players are allowed to debate and discuss things. There's certainly provisions for cutting deals, because you can trade, I believe, faction influence and cards, unplayed cards with one another, in exchange for deals as well. I'm sorry. During the elections, you can also spend your influence, and they count 3 votes each, and I believe that can be done off your cards as well. I'm not positive about that. Some issues will have judicial review, which means if the practice of judicial review is in place, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court has the outright right to just say, no, that's not happening. And that is a canceled issue, which has its own special rules on the card that'll be handled there, as opposed to just the failed or ignored issues. And in general, if an issue is successfully resolved, it's put over here in the resolved issues box. And if it's failed, it's removed from the game. But some issues will say, put them in the next deck. You've just punted them down the way, maybe by certain resolutions. Okay. You know what? I'm capable of making a pause in this video, so I'm going to do that as I go forward. All right. Now remember, the president draws 4 of these issues out of here, but he also is able to grab some taxes and pass taxes or tariffs, which he's only allowed 1 tariff in here. When he does these, what he has to do is he assigns it to the Secretary of Treasury, I think in general, and then it has to pass through the normal difficulty process. Congress has to vote on it. And it can also be repealed, in which case you bring up a current tax and essentially vote on it to repeal it. And when you repeal, instead of the pass-fail type situation, you have a passed and repealed situation in terms of popularity. And in general, you gain popularity by repealing taxes, but tariffs are kind of interesting. They're more popular than unpopular because they protect business, etc. And of course, in certain parts of the country, they are not popular, but I don't think there's a way of handling that in here. Now, when you do a tax rather than a tariff, whenever you pass it, you're going to have to roll on this outrage table here. And you add the number of existing taxes that have been activated and the modifier on the new tax, which is listed here, and a die roll. And you get an effect. And the effect essentially runs from nothing up to penalties for the President and Secretary of Treasury in terms of popularity. It can also even increase tension, which has some interesting possible optional rolls, which we won't play with this time. All right. President and Secretary, yeah, okay. Tariffs, however, you're only allowed to pass 1 per term, and you can pass a new tariff or repeal one. They don't roll on the outrage table, and they don't count as one of the issues the president must draw. New states, these I believe are handled only by the president. If the president succeeds in getting it passed, though, it gets added to the board and it'll be available for elections. The president can, as I said, boot 1 issue over to the vice president and make him the temporary president for that issue, for 1 issue at a time. Offices, in general. So, in general, each person can hold no more than 1 office. When they get an office, there's a certain popularity bonus that you immediately get if you're being appointed to it for the first time. If it's a reappointment for a dead office holder, you don't get the popularity for it, which is kind of buried in the rules for some of the aspects. You can't just hand an office out to anyone. For the most part, the president has to give all his offices out to his own party. However, as you can see, Jefferson's sitting on an office here. These are the partisan offices. General is not partisan. Vice President is not partisan. Chief Justice is not partisan. But most of the others are. And all of the others. And what was I going to say there? Okay, in order to be eligible, you can only assign 1 of these partisan offices to somebody outside of your party. Now, there's one character here, Eldridge Gary, who doesn't count as, well, he counts as both parties, which means he's eligible for an office from either party. He's got an interesting situation in terms of, we'll have to worry about him for presidency, but he's got special rules that apply to him, essentially. If you're being offered another office, you can generally resign your office. The president and vice president cannot, but other people can resign an office so that they're eligible for an office they're being offered. Apparently, you can resign Chief Justice for an office. The general, you can only be appointed to the office of general if the office is vacant, or if a new nominee has a higher ability, or if the holder of the office is not of the president's party. The statesman must have military ability, like Washington does here. Washington's military ability isn't probably terribly necessary, because, well, if he loses his first term, he's out. Or if he doesn't get a second term. If there's no such statesman available, then you can relax this to make any statesman other than the president or vice president able to be made the general. Okay. When you get your new office, you get a popularity in most cases. Okay, the Treasury, you're going to gain or lose the revenue from your reserves. Then you're going to pay interest. If your reserves are negative, you multiply that by 3 divided by 10, you get a 30%, round down, and that is subtracted from the reserves, making them even more negative. So you have a continuing debt going there. Okay, if reserves are negative and exceed 100, for every 100 you're going to get a penalty on the economic crisis table here. And that has a possibility, I think you roll what, 1 die? Yeah, and subtract 1 for each 100 that you're negative. If that gets far enough down, well, it's fairly easy to get that far down. The president loses popularity, his party loses popularity and support. Eventually, it goes down to a monetary collapse, which will end the game, and the president loses tons of popularity. If he's going to lose tons of popularity, my guess is the game ending that way still can be won by someone. Oh, where are we? Elections. Okay. There's essentially 4 different roles for elections, and it depends on the state of the government. The game starts out, I'm trying to see if it's here, it's not. The game starts out in a situation where the 12th Amendment isn't passed, linking presidential and vice presidential candidates, and the parties, there's no single party system in place. The 4 options involve those 2 variables, 12th Amendment being passed and whether you're in a 2-party or 1-party system, essentially. Let's go over what some of the base core rules that follow all of it, the base rules, and then we'll look a little bit at the differences. They suggest only really worrying about the base situation when you're explaining the game, but I figure you're looking for more in-depth, even if not more effective. Okay, so the goal of the election is to get certain electoral votes. You're going to be claiming the states by playing these little cubes, which are indicative of a certain candidate. There can be more than 4 candidates. There's only 4 colors of cubes, but we could use others. We could use white cubes, green cubes, black cubes, other little pieces, because there can be, I think, up to like 8 candidates on the board. Maybe more than that. That could, but those are really unlikely situations. The first cube that's placed is going to be placed on the statesman's home state unless there's no vacancy. If it's the presidential candidate, then the cube will be placed as close to the home state as possible. If it's the vice president without a vacancy in his home state, he has to be placed adjacent to that of his running mate. If there's no such available vacancy, then the vice president can only be placed in a state which is not contiguous with those of the East Coast. Well, at the beginning of the game, that's not an issue, but say California enters as a state, and that's clearly not going to connect to any of the other states, so that would be allowable. That can cause you real problems, though, and you'll see how the election plays out. The actuality is California probably doesn't even enter in except in that particularly odd circumstance, and I just had to go on my tether. And then each player is going to be placing a cube on a state having a vacancy adjacent to the one where he already has a cube. If there's no such state, he can only place a cube on unattached states that don't run back. So yeah, California will run into it. People can get their votes there eventually anyhow. Jeez. Cord is just a little too short. Okay, so the base situation at the beginning of the game is two-party elections with pre-passage, before the passage of the 12th Amendment. And the nomination, there's going to be, each party nominates both the conservatives and liberals. The nominee is the in-play eligible statesman of that party who has the highest popularity. That popularity is going to be a combination of the popularity of the actual person, along with any white cubes that they have sitting on top of their card, their personal popularity. Once the presidential nominees are chosen, they choose a vice presidential running mate who must be of the same party. A statesman doesn't have to take this unless he's the last possible choice left, kind of like the last possible choice in Republic of Rome rules. And now, if a party doesn't have public support, i.e. that's whichever side this is leaning towards, then they have to choose their running mate first. If public support is 0, the less popular candidate has to declare first. If they're tied, the younger candidate, and younger is the higher number down here. That's going to be the age value. So he's a 6, DeWitt Clinton's a 21. And then you clear this, whatever cubes there are over here on the states. And this is where we're going to be. So let me move the rules over here, see if we can represent this a little easier. And then the presidential candidate and the party which and then each state is going to have 2 vacancies in this case, 2 slots for different candidates to place their pieces into. The presidential then they take turns placing cubes. Each state has 2 vacancies, and each of the candidates has a unique set of cubes. First, the presidential candidate of the party with the most public support gets to go. Now, on this first play, if you have the most public support, you have the right to force the other side to go in your place instead. But then after that, you have to follow the order. And then the vice presidential candidate of the party which has the most public support, then the presidential candidate of the other party, vice presidential candidate of the other party. Public support is 0. The one who has the most popularity and then age gets to go first. You cannot place 2 of your cubes in the same state. However, both you and your running mate can place in the same state. Now, as you start placing your cubes, and remember there were restrictions on where your first cube was, it goes in your home state, and then you kind of grow out of there, expanding, and you get to play this little control game. And it's going to be kind of funny because you don't get to control who the nominee is, so it may be deterministic who's going to win, given the tactics on playing out on this little mini game on the board. But the winner is going to be calculated as follows. Each candidate gets votes equal to the electoral votes of the state. This is in era A, B, and then later C. Some states just keep the same electoral value throughout. To win, the candidate has to have more votes than any other candidates. This candidate will become the president, regardless of whether he was nominated as vice president. Yeah, there was someone who tried that. I believe that would be Burr. The nominee receiving the second highest number of votes becomes the vice president, even if he was nominated as president or if he was a member of the other party or whatever. Complicated shit could happen before the 12th Amendment. There are tiebreaker rules for handling this, which basically say you kick it to Congress, and Congress then... it doesn't quite go to Congress. It doesn't go to Congress in the sense of voting here, because these votes kind of indicate something else. What it actually goes to is the person who has the most representatives from a given state wins that state's senators. And it's the senators, which doesn't make sense. It should be the House, if I recall correctly. I don't know. The person who has the most representative statesmen of that state, I guess, wins the House vote for that state, in whatever way that goes. Anyway, I don't really remember the rules for that. It's been a long time. Not in the game, I mean in reality. So I can't comment on it. But I thought it was a straight vote of the House. Maybe each state has one vote, though, in the House. If there's a tie for vice president, same tiebreaker takes place. Okay. Now, what about the differences? So, when you have already passed the 12th Amendment, the big difference here is that you have a nominee of each party, as before, and they pick a vice presidential running mate of the same party. And they're each going to still have their own cubes to play, but I believe there's only one vacancy in each state. So the vice president's going to be competing, sort of, with the presidential candidate. However, the victor is a combination of the two votes. So if the vice president starts filling some of these out, those are just counting towards the presidential total. He's just delivering some states for that ticket and can't end up surpassing. Now, the next option is single-party elections. This happens if one side completely dominates the public opinion. That's if public support is at 9 or higher, and 9 is quite far on this track. In that case, the other party is not allowed to field a candidate. And this gets kind of weird the way the rules are written, but I think if I interpret them literally. In this case, the most popular eligible statesman is going to run for president, along with up to 3 of the next most popular candidates. The 3 next most popular candidates can all choose to run for president. Then each of them has the option to nominate a vice president. That person has to agree. It can't, I think, be someone who is running for president. And they can share a vice presidential candidate here. Then you clear the table. Everybody's going to place their cubes. There's 2 slots per space. And you place your pieces as normal. Each candidate will be getting votes for each of his markers equal to the state's total for the era. To win the president, you have to have more votes than any other candidate and more than half the vote total. This still could be the vice president winning the presidency, the vice presidential candidate winning the presidency, which is particularly interesting because say 2 candidates run for president and there's one vice president who kind of is able to convince both the presidential candidates to take him along, or maybe 2 out of 3 presidential candidates to take him along. He could well win the presidency by running for vice president in that manner, however you want to look at that. And then the second highest number of votes becomes the vice president, even if originally nominated for president. But this is important. This guy has to have more votes than any other candidate to be president, and more than half the vote total of all the votes available in the states. Now, that more than half sounds hard to do, except remember there's 2 slots, so there's double the number of votes total available. He's getting both presidential and vice presidential votes, whatever. If no nominee has a majority or there's a tie for either president or vice president, you go to the tiebreaker rules, which is a big deal. It's quite possible that no one can get the 50%, in which case you go to those tiebreaker rules, which we'll get to in a minute. Likewise, it's also possible for a single-party election post-passage of the 12th Amendment. Again, if it's 9 or higher, one person must run for president. Any or all of the 3 next most popular may run for as well. And then any statesman who's not running for president can be nominated by vice president. As before, you can have multiple presidents running with the same running mate. The cubes, there's going to be 2 vacancies per state, a presidential and a vice presidential vacancy. The presidents will be on the left, the vice presidents on the right. And in order to win the presidency, you need more votes than any other president, and more than 50% of the vote is determined, total determined. And the vice presidency works the same exact way as the presidency. So you have to win both. Well, you don't have to win both. It's possible you can end up with a split ticket this way. I think that is actually false in terms of the historical situation. I know currently you walk into the booth and you vote for president and vice president together. And I believe the old tickets were the same way. They had both candidates on them, at least Civil War era. I don't know if early on in the 12th, after the 12th Amendment, people were casting separate ballots for different candidates, but I don't think that's the case. So it's very weird, the idea of splitting the ticket there. I think that's actually an error in the game. Okay. So now, let's go to the tiebreaker, and then we'll hit this little special issue here of retiring presidents. So when there's a tiebreaker, what you have to do is consider each state in an order decided by the current president. The state's votes will be decided by the statesmen who come from it, and they can vote for any of the nominees involved in the tiebreaker. Tiebreaker means certain people get dropped, actually. I believe it's the 4th most, the biggest guy gets dropped from each race. A statesman can vote for any nominee. He doesn't have to vote on his own party or anything like that. Whoever gets the most total congressional votes wins the state. And then the nominee is the person who wins the most states. If there's a tie for the most states, the Chief Justice gets to break that tie. If he's a vacant office, the nominee with the most popularity just wins. And if it's still tied, it'll be to the oldest person, the person with the lowest age number. Okay. When a president just gets either he's had 2 terms, or I believe if he's not reelected, what happens is he's going to be out of the game. But however many popularity cubes he has on his card gets scored as victory points before he's removed, and those cubes then go back into the pool for players to have access to. That's complicated. We'll have to see how it works in practice, especially under different flavors. We probably won't see all the flavors in one game. All right, I think it's time for another break. Okay. Now we come to sort of the individual player turns part of the game. This is the people phase. First thing that happens is each person gets an influence point, one of these cubes, in their player faction, just as a bonus. Then the party leaders, who I have marked here, there's the Conservative Party leader, and this is determined, I believe, by popularity, and the Liberal Party leader. And it's total popularity, not just the marker on their card. Any white cubes they have, add to that. Gets an additional influence on their card. that's influence that they can use for their particular things, and I believe they can use them in votes, and also they can use them when they're resolving issues personally, and there may be other things that you can use it for. And then cards may give people additional influence. For example, I think some of the marriageable women give you influence. Okay, then 7 cards are going to be drawn from the action deck. That includes the statesman, etc. Those are going to be handed first to the person with the least victory points plus popularity. And you're going to pass them down the line in that order. And you're going to be playing this sort of drafting game where you look at your card with the pack of 7 cards or whatever's left, and you take one of them. And then there's tiebreakers there, fewest votes in Congress, and the oldest statesman. And it says discard cards are not drafted. Okay. You're only allowed to hold 3 action cards at a time. If you have too many, you're going to have to either discard or draw another or play one. Statesmen can only be played if their home state is in the nation at this point. When the action deck is exhausted the first time, you're going to reshuffle a second deck in with these new cards and with the discards. And when it's exhausted the second time, you shuffle Generation 3 in to form a new deck. After that, you'll shuffle whatever discards there are, which probably won't be any statesmen, although some might get discarded for one reason or another because somebody doesn't have room in their hand and that statesman doesn't have his state in play. Okay. The next thing that happens is each party leader gets to play on the fun newspapers track. And this is another complicated little subsystem here. Cubes that are in the bottom of the track may be moved to the upper half or left in place. Putting them in the upper half means you're going to start cashing these in as support. The party that holds the presidency goes first. On turn 1, there's not going to be any newspaper. Nobody has any papers under their control. Now, what do you use for chips for this? That's a good question. Looks like we have a lot of different colors here. Two Conservative Party and a Liberal. I guess you use these as the Liberals and these as the Conservatives. I'm not sure. And those are also the cubes that you're going to use for voting. There's no real limit there, though. Okay. Well, how did they get there? Yeah, that happens during the individual player turn part of things, which is actually just the round of this. First, the player controlling the president gets to do his player turn, and then each player, clockwise, counterclockwise in my case, gets to do the same. Okay. They can spend influence from their faction, from their supplies, and or their statesmen. But influence on a statesman can only be played either for the faction as a whole or for that specific statesman. You can only do each one of these once in a turn. You can make a speech, and these are, everything's all kind of spelled out here as to the different stages there, and then here are the different things you can do spelled out. Making a speech, you spend your influence point, you indicate the statesman who's doing it, in case you're using your core group influence, and you roll a die. After that, you can spend additional influence, each of which will add 1 to the die. If you roll a 6, you get a point of popularity. Now, popularity is important because that's how you get victory points, is, well, when a president seems to die. We'll see about other death. I believe they also generate you victory points. You can whip up support. Now, you can do all of these if you want to spend. This moves public support in the direction of the player's statesman, of the party of the statesman. You name a statesman, expend an influence, and roll a die, and see how much you move. You can fund newspapers. You pick a statesman, and then you either spend an influence to place a party cube of that statesman's party on the start position of the newspaper's track, which is over here, or you can spend 2 influence to shift that cube further down. Now, we're not going to be using these green cubes. We're going to be using the colored cubes of the parties. But let's pretend a green cube's here. So if this was here, I could pay 1 to do this, or I could move one of these guys for 2 influence forward. Okay. I can never shift them this way up from the top level. So the question is how much I want to build up my newspaper power, and then once I built it up, the party leader can push 1 forward, and then they can start scoring more immediate public support off those. Okay. After each player's had 1 initiative, there's going to be 1 bonus initiative, and that goes up for auction. Starting with the person to the left of the president, each player is allowed to bid their influence cubes. The bid must exceed any previous bids or be a pass. The winner of the extra initiative is going to get a bonus card from the action deck immediately and a chance to do 1 more of the 3 actions if they want to pay. Now, it costs you influence to make this extra action, and then to take the extra initiative, and then it's going to cost you to do whichever one of these you choose. Plus, the initiative's not as rich. You can do all 3 of these in a normal action. You can only do 1 of these in your extra initiative that you bid for. All right. Well, the game can end by tensions going up and the Civil War being reached. Or if there's a monetary collapse, or when the last issue card is drawn, and then a final election is going to be conducted eventually without any partisan officers being appointed, and then the game will be over. At that point, you count your total victory cubes that you have on your statesman, plus whatever victory points you've cashed in already. And whoever has the most wins. However, if it ended due to monetary collapse or civil war, you lose your Congress votes from your total and the number of influence points you currently hold on the board. Basically, you're going to be more blamed for screwing the game. But there's no everybody loses situation in here. Okay. When somebody dies, right, so there's rules, if the president dies, the vice president takes over, and what happens with the offices in those cases. But also, whoever dies, you have to worry about updating your congressional votes to the loss of that statesman. You get influence, any influence points get returned to the supply. You get victory points equal to the popularity cubes that you have. So every time one of your statesmen dies, you score his popularity. So that's where I kind of say, well, this is the victory conditions to it, is this random coalition of people who maybe are good buddies or something, but they don't necessarily share the same ideology. They don't necessarily work together in any sense of the word. They're no current or anything like that. It's just how well you can score your random assortment of people, which feels kind of funky to me. I don't understand what I'm supposed to represent in this game, except some weird assortment of people. Yeah. And that's kind of disappointing. I'm wondering if there's something I can tweak. It would be massive with the game to change that, but we'll play it out as written. It's possible you might have to replace an officer in the midst of an issue who's needed for that issue. Okay. Eldridge Gary, he's a special person who's never part of a party. He's never the party leader, even if he's president. If he's the president, he can appoint offices as he likes. Anyone can appoint him office as if he's part of their party. He can only run for president if there's single party dominance, though. And then they say in event of an economic crisis, public support moves towards zero instead of away from a party. He announces he's got some special rules, basically, if he's running for president. Okay, a bunch of optional rules here. So one is reduced factions. If your faction is down to only one statesman, normally if you're down to none, you're able to grab a statesman from the person who has the most statesmen. Well, this is an option. If you're down to only one, you can do this. I'm not playing with that. There's black reputation. Now this one I think has an interesting effect on play. The first time a player plays an action that increases tension, he takes a black cube. If the game ends due to civil war, any player having such a cube can't win. Which means if you've done something to push the civil war forward, you're excluded from ever winning the game through a civil war. You have to make sure it doesn't occur. That sounds like a very interesting option. That's the one I'm most tempted to play with. Well, no, there's another one that I am. The danger with that, I think, is that it's very easy, I think, for actions to happen that might cause tensions to rise. If a president... See, what's not clear here, so choosing to ignore to pay off war bonds issues increases tension. Since the president made this choice, his faction takes a cube. However, if he hands it off to the Secretary of the Treasury, that person would get the cube instead. What's not absolutely clear is whether or not, it has to be a voluntary choice. If you try to fix the issue and screw it up, do you get a black cube for that? Should you? I don't know. So that's a little fuzzy to me. And my feeling is I'd rather play the game without that to see what I want to do. But what I think could be interesting about that is that kind of throws you more into the, hey, let's not crash the game because I'm going to win, because I can't win if I help do that. So that might be more interesting. Persuasion is another interesting sounding one, which I'm not going to play with again. It allows you to put a player disc on one of your statesmen. That's going to denote that you're the faction leader. You'll be immune to persuasion. During the people phase, when players get their individual turns, immediately after control newspapers, each player can change their faction leader. Persuasion is now a new option that's listed before make a speech. It's going to cost you can try it once per initiative, and it follows whatever rules are back here. I don't know if it has a cost, but basically you get a modifier based on your persuader. You have to roll a total of 12 or more. You roll 2 dice. If you roll a 2, you fail. If you roll less than 12, you can spend influence. You do have to spend an influence to do this, and it can get you one of the other members, one of the other statesmen, onto your side. That too sounds interesting to me, in the sense that it might, because it kind of has state bonuses. I'm assuming it's same party. President or party leader, popularity, persuader. See, it doesn't seem like you have to do it to the same target and his faction leader. See, within 5 in age from same state, yeah. So it doesn't look like the political current, conservative or liberal, has any effect on this. It just seems I was hoping maybe it would help you conglomerate the power in the hands of one, so that all the liberals would be within certain players, all the conservatives within others. It doesn't even look like it does that. It looks like you'll have states aligning, though, which would be of some value, because quite honestly, a lot of the politics is based more on the states than anything else. So that one's kind of interesting. Like a Republic of Rome has that persuasion going on in it all the time. But I don't really want to mess with the core with these variants. Largely, I like doing them. And then there's another one where there's not as much negotiation. They suggested for a 3-player or solo or 2-player. It's a means of kind of drafting the offices instead of the president just handing them out. The president probably needs to hand them out to gain support in a 6-player game, to get people who will vote for, what he wants. So, I guess we're ready to take a shot at this. It's not everything I hoped for, and the video was longer than perhaps any of us hoped for. But I did have to work my way through it. And just as a hey, if you skip to the end, I should have said this at the beginning. I believe Rick did an introductory video, which is much, much more useful than mine. Mine is, in part, I'm trying to learn the rules along with presenting them. And you could say that's useless. Well, it's not like I'm getting paid, right? It does give, I think, some value to people who want to look for this. And if you don't want to see this, well, at least I got another review of the rules, although I don't know how much that's going to be helpful, because I'm going to be basically playing the game along with the rules open. It's the playthroughs that are important to me rather than these intros and reviews, even if more people watch them. So, such is, right?